Welcoming you all here today to the Ethics Centre. This organisation has been going on for about 25 years now, just over 25 years. It's not a moral policeman, it's really a place that's designed to try and help people explore issues in a safe and welcoming environment. And one of the things we've learned over the years is that challenging unthinking custom and practice, which often causes so much to go wrong in the world, is best done by increasing the diversity of voices, the diversity of opinions which are available to us in the world. So when Di was talking with her colleagues at Dawn about this possibility of having a conversation about Asian Australian leadership, it was something which I really wanted to be involved in, because I think there's a huge opportunity for the whole of our society if people start to look at this untapped resource that we have in our midst. So tonight's using a little round table technique that we use. It's not very sophisticated, as you can see. For people who are sitting here, you get my best side, I'm sorry. Sorry about those who've chosen to be over there. But I would encourage you, if you've got something you want to say, to just come up and join the conversation. It's not very frightening. It could be a question, but it might also be something which you're sitting there saying, why haven't they said such and such? Why haven't they said such and such? But I would also ask too to bear in mind that Ken and Wesa have not prepared for this. It's not as if they've come along with completely developed scripts where they know precisely what we're going to talk about and therefore what they're going to say. So give them a bit of room as well, because they'll be thinking out loud, and that's much more difficult to do than just serve up a pre-digested view. So as I mentioned, we've got Ken Wu from PwC. He's a lawyer, background in commerce and law, heading up the asset management area, but tax law is really your area. Yes. And for 25 years you've been a member of PwC, and 15 years of those as a partner with an international practice. Wesa Chow's got more awards than I can even try and remember. It's a great long list that goes through. But also you trained as an engineer originally, didn't you? And also did a degree in commerce. But since you've been working very much in the cross-cultural environment. So we've got some fantastic people to talk about this issue. So when Di and I were thinking about how we might begin this series, we thought, well, let's take something really fundamental to see whether or not there is anything, really something, that might be culturally significant in the way in which men and women separately relate within the workplace, how that might have a bearing upon opportunities for leadership. So that's really our topic for today, at least as a starting point. And I want to start with a speech which Tin Soot Pomasan gave a little while back, and which you commented on during an SBS broadcast about it, around the concept of the bamboo ceiling. And I want to add to that whether or not there's also the traditional glass ceiling for women, and how those two things start to intersect. Wesa, we might start with you.
So I guess for women, Asian women, you've got the double whammy, where you've got your glass ceiling, where women, being a woman is very much part of you, but then you've got the cultural aspects that's in addition to that. And I mean, some of that will play out in terms of, the value to the family and things like that. So even traditionally, women don't like to speak out. And obviously that's not all women, but so we're taught pretty much at a very young age, especially for the women at home, to not speak against authority, and obviously that's for Asian men as well. But then, so you've got the gender perspective, and then you've got also the Asian perspective that kind of mixed in together, and obviously it's really hard for anyone to say, well, that's my, that's the gender influence and that's the cultural influence, but obviously it's a mesh of the two.
Now, as you noted, there's a real danger in having these conversations that for every stereotype or generalisation we make, there will be an exception.
Yes,
so there'll be people sitting in the room saying, that's not me,
yeah,
which is fair enough, but there may be some general tendencies. You're at slightly different generations as well, I think. So I'm wondering how you relate to what Wesa was just saying there, Ken.
So I'd make an initial observation about the concept of the glass ceiling or the bamboo ceiling, and this applies equally to both, and that is that I think it's interesting when there's a concept of there being a single glass or single bamboo ceiling that applies. So if you just look at, in the context of the business I'm in, I think there's a broad assumption that people would make that if you become a partner, then you have broken through the bamboo ceiling.
Yeah.
But that ignores the fact that one, having become a partner, could have aspirations beyond that. And so there may in fact be a series of bamboo ceilings. Equally, there's a series of glass ceilings. So having established that there's different, I guess, levels of ceilings being bamboo and glass, then what's the difference and where does that arise?
So you're never really free of the downward pressure that comes. You just break through one level to find another way.
Well, in its most difficult form, it manifests itself as condescension. So it would be to say that you've done so well for someone who is this, and you should be very satisfied and content with what you've got.
Have you had that happen or seen it said to others?
Oh, I've seen it happen, and it's interesting that people can get upset about it, and some people can just think, well, it was just a simple statement. And so this is where it becomes very important to delve a little bit deeper into the difference between what is cultural and what is gender. And the difference is that if you are female, you may not necessarily grow up feeling different because 51% of the population are women. But if you have grown up feeling different because you're a smaller percentage of the population and you're not in the majority, where that can manifest itself is that if you are in a meeting and someone disagrees with you, you could either experience that as someone attacking you, or you could experience that as disagreement that really starts to dent your confidence. And from a male point of view, I experience that as someone trying to attack me, and I need to sort of park that and leave that at the door and say, no, this person is simply disagreeing. But I think that from a gender perspective, it's possible to experience this as something which will harm your confidence. And if it harms your confidence, it harms your ability to articulate and present your view. And what I think is very important in determining how far anybody goes in their career, it's their presentation skills. And the presentation skills are underpinned by confidence, and that confidence is then underpinned by how you experience things.
You mentioned in the brief interview that you did, you said that people who grow up with a respect for authority may be less inclined to speak out and therefore may be less judged to be leadership material,
correct,
in inverted commas, because they haven't shown that thrusting confidence.
Yes.
And is that again still an issue, do you think, or?
I think it's one of many. I've looked at behaviours, particularly based on my own experience, to better understand how my behaviours are interpreted, how they have been concluded, and then what the opportunity is, and therefore how I can go about changing the way I behave to better, I guess, better acknowledge how they get interpreted and how to better manage the perceptions about my leadership potential that are being perceived by those who are scanning the environment, of which I am one of many being scanned and compared.
And so when that happens, do you draw attention to the fact that there are different leadership styles that can be just as effective without necessarily being brash and noisy?
I think this is an interesting point that comes back to your initial observation, Simon, that we're from different generations. So it depends on, I guess, the experience that you've had and how you need to calibrate it. So if you look at the generation I came from, Australia today is very different to the Australia in the 1970s. So it would not be appropriate for me to bring my experience from the 70s into the environment today with those views, because they would just be less relevant, and that would lead to...
We might just pause for a moment and find out there are some more delicate controls perhaps down there underneath in the cupboard below that might be easier to adjust. But maybe what we'll do is we'll speak up a bit, because that... Can you hear us if we speak about that loud? Okay, so don't worry about Di, we'll all just speak up a bit. So we started listening to Ken talking about how he sees some of these differences, and particularly the experience of whether or not you're being attacked or not. How do you relate to that as a younger woman growing up in contemporary Australia?
Well, I suppose, observing my personal growing up, you don't really experience it until you probably reach a stage where you're trying to get up to a higher level of leadership. So all throughout high school, throughout university, you feel accepted mostly, and obviously sometimes there may be racism and discrimination at school, but then if you haven't experienced that, at university you'll see lots of Asian faces, and so you don't really feel like you are being discriminated against before university. So all that time seems to be quite, I suppose, opportunities are there. But then after that you start working, and then soon you hit, you know, I suppose you can either say the glass ceiling or the bamboo ceiling, whichever. Or both. And you're trying to get to another level of leadership. That's when you start to hear, you know, people disagreeing with you, or sometimes simply just disagreeing with you because they don't want you to be in that position.
But do you experience it as an attack, or...?
I like to see it as not an attack, because, I mean, sometimes obviously you go through your own processes of thinking, okay, why are they doing this? Are they doing that just to attack me? But I think for me, I like to see it as, no, they're just disagreeing, like what Ken said, because it makes it easier on yourself to actually get to that next level. I think if you start seeing everyone as being attacking you, then you're going to have a very miserable life.
Yeah. Let me encourage anybody, if you want to come up, you've got a comment or a question, you think there's some point of view, just jump up. It's very easy to do.
I just moved the chair while that invitation's been asked and that in the film. So, yes, please do jump up whenever you can.
Oh, you're going, oh, no, okay. Well done, see, a bit of leadership. Just speaking to this microphone, it won't amplify, but it'll pick it up.
Thank you. I certainly really sort of, it really speaks to me in terms of what you've said. It strikes a chord. I feel the same sentiment as well. It was only when I was given the opportunity to grow as a leader or grow at work, and I worked at some great places, corporates. And they really gave me the opportunity to grow and to develop. And I actually found myself not feeling very worthy. So there were a couple of promotions where I actually said, I'm not ready. And in terms of exercising my voice, I probably didn't do that as much. It took a little while for me to realise that maybe in my upbringing, there was something, a residue there that sort of held me back. So
Let's make sure this is on.
thanks. So being held back in terms of not speaking out. You're always told as a child to keep your head down, study hard, work really, really hard, and you'll be rewarded. And of course, hearing that, that may be not the case. In sometimes it does work, depending on the maturity and the kind of your manager. So if they're looking after you and they'll notice how you're acting under particular stresses or whatever, they will help you to develop. I did have that. But I also do think that the way that our workplace is actually set up is very yang. It's for an extrovert, outward display of seeking that, sort of that ambition.
It's interesting you should say, the first half of what you said, I think there is a lot of research to show that women, from whatever their background, if they can do most of the job, will feel guilty, even if they can do 90% of it, if they're actually given it. Whereas men, providing they reckon they can do about 47% of it, will be totally contented to be promoted. Yep. And so I think there's a gender difference more generally about that. But I wonder whether or not there's something, if you add in the Asian cultural different. Of course, there's many different cultures within Asia too. Whether there's anything that we can generalise about that, because a lot of accounting firms couldn't keep women even if they tried to open up the glass ceiling because they didn't feel the values of the organisation related to them. So they'd go off and they'd say, okay, yeah, I could be a partner, but no, I'd rather set up something where I can actually create something which is more consistent with what I hope for in my life.
Do you think it's also, I think, to something that you said earlier about authority? Because, you know, I have a deep respect for authority. I've been brought up that way. So, you know, you toe the line and you kind of, and it's a kind of a, is it a fear? I'm not sure. That's a fear of...
Yeah, well, I would say if you have a look at how promotion happens in Asia, well, many countries in Asia, the manager will be promoting the person below them. So if you don't have the recognition of your manager, you're never going to get a promotion, basically. It's not like here where you submit your application to another role. So, I mean, in that respect, it's very different. And I think it's also driven kind of part of our culture where we do want our supervisor to know what we've done, all the hard work that we've put in, and be able to say to us, you know, you should apply for so-and-so job before you do it. Almost seeking that recognition first.
Ken, you're very senior in your firm. Have you been able to affect change in terms of this balance that was just being talked about? You know, the more of the yang, more of the thrusting things. In other words, your own personal style, has that been of any impact on the organisation?
I think that when it comes to the way in which people assess what is work, there's some very important distinctions to be made. And so I can observe a lot of Asian cultural background graduates who start with us. And for the first 18 months, when in doubt, the strategy is work harder. But that strategy...
Does that mean work longer?
Work longer, work harder on Appendix 5 to the report, perfected, get the numbers right, and get the fonts right and improve it. But there comes a time then when you need to, first of all, invest more time in understanding your career and the career dynamics and the environment you're in. So you need to scan to understand what is it that will get me promoted. Is it doing more of the same of what I do, or does it involve doing things which are not part of my job description, which are discretionary and within the realm of the level above? So when I think about, do I think about the need to do discretionary things, and do I understand the dynamic there? So let me just delve for a minute into an example. So if I do a discretionary activity, let's say I write a technical paper and get it published, and someone else who does the same thing, but they are more capable of self-promoting the fact that they have done that, and they get recognition for it, and I perhaps don't, then I can fall into a very dangerous syndrome, which is what I described as the why bother syndrome. So why bother doing it next time? And the reason why you have to bother is because the point of comparison will come up next time round that someone has done a second paper and you have not done one. And because it's discretionary activities, which are very key pointers to promotion, the comparative disadvantage emerges. So the difficulty then is to say, how do I maintain the ability to keep doing discretionary activities? So in the Diversity Council report that was done last year, one of the telling bits of information that came out of it was that when people feel that they've been denied opportunity, they are 25% less likely to do discretionary activities. And so the gap starts to widen. And that's why we end up in situations where we start with a percentage of our workforce who have a diverse cultural background, and that thins up as we move up the ranks.
It thins?
Yes. Because
they're broken by the effort they make not being recognised?
No, I don't know if it's broken. I think that when I think about my own upbringing, it's very important. Success was very important. And if you have parents who have migrated to Australia, they've normally made some sacrifices to start a new life. And in an Asian way of thinking, this is based on my own experience, a lot of it is done for the benefit of the next generation.
And what did they define as success for you? Because I'm going to ask a similar question of you as to whether, as a woman, success is defined differently by your parents and your grandparents.
Yeah.
So for you, what did they think success was?
Oh, I think that initially success is academic excellence. So the mantra of study hard, the mantra of then working hard, being industrious is important, and then I guess achieving what are the typical indicators of success. So for someone like me moving into the field I moved into would be becoming an equity owner in the business.
Okay. And for you, how do your mother and father think of success for you? Would it be different to what might have been expected for Ken? And your grandmother and your mother looking at you, what would they count as the emblematic things that would show success for your life?
It's similar, but having said that, there's a lot more emphasis, especially towards women, to have a successful family life as well. So, you know, having a good husband and having good kids as being an indicator of success, as well as if you are, you know, as a young woman working in any sector to achieve a level of seniority.
So would there be an expectation that if you came to a critical point of choice between investing, if you like, in the husband and family or investing in the career that you've been building over time,
It will be family.
it would be the family
Yes.
first?
Yeah.
In a way that would be different than might be falling on a man?
Yes, it would be. I would think so. And also what I also see among peers, where I do see quite a lot of the women who would want to sacrifice their own career for their family. And they would, you know, so if they had a choice, obviously they wouldn't want to do that. But if there's this critical moment where they think, well, should I choose family or career, they would rather sacrifice the career over family.
And if you encountered a young woman who made a different choice,
Yep.
who said, actually, I'm choosing my career over family, what would your innate response be? Bad decision, or that's okay, or...
For me, I would say that's okay, personally. But I think in terms of the community as a whole, it depends actually. It depends on whether or not the woman is able to juggle the two. I think if the woman is able to juggle the two, that particular woman would be seen as a role model.
I want to come back to you in a moment. I'm going to ask you both to paint a picture for me of what an organisation would be like if it was run by a woman from an Asian Australian background,
Yep.
and what it would be like if it was run by a man. So you won't be able to compare notes,
Yep.
and see what you think would the key
Yeah.
attributes be, whether there's any difference or not. But before we do, Lindley Edwards, welcome.
Yeah.
Lindley's
Thank
a
you, Simon.
long-standing friend, so here you are. So
I'm listening to the conversation with interest, and I would like to point out that sexism and also when we're getting into a position of being any form of discrimination, that hurts men as much as women. And a lot of these conversations happen to be about what it's like to be a woman. I think we need to broaden the discussion and to say what are the impacts on our society, on our economy. And you've noticed the IMF have been very vocal about women and the importance of women in the economy, because 70% of decisions about where money will be spent in the household come from women. So why wouldn't we make the discussion broader and say, as a man, if you're adopting a position that is intolerant to other people or is not giving the best opportunities to people who come from a diverse background or who are female, you're impacting your economic wealth and you're impacting your organisation.
so it's an appeal to enlightened self-interest, is it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that, and we're asking here about power-based change, and no one wants to give up power. I've never met anyone who loves giving up power. And what I think is really interesting is all these people in this room, the power base is happening. We're seeing a move of power from west to east. Now, most of the people in this room are going to be in a better place to engage with the growth centre of the world being parts of Asia than anyone who comes from a traditional white Anglo-Saxon background. So if you don't like don't fight for the power that's dying, go and grab the power that's there. And there's a thing that someone told me when I first started in the Macquarie Bank and I had to compete against men and I was doing business development. Don't try and take accounts off the existing guys. Go and create new forms of wealth where you're not competing. So I would appeal to all of you. You're the people changing the face of Australia, which needs to be changed. And you're in a better place than most of the people who are maybe stopping you. So go and change the game, change the conversation, change the narrative, change the power base.
Okay, thank you. Little rallying call from Lindsay Edwards. Now, before we do, now you've had a chance to think, so
Yep.
I might start with you. Describe for me the ideal organisation that you would create. What would it look like?
I think I would see it as the whole company as a family, and sometimes we kind of see it in some of the Asian drama where you've got a woman who's looking after a family business and she would run it like a family and be able to pull in all these aspects and making sure everyone feel included within the organisation. I suppose, that's what I've come up with at this stage.
Would you have started with that analogy?
I wasn't listening, actually. I was thinking about what I'm about to say.
Right.
So I'll be honest.
Well, maybe now you say what you're going to say, and we'll see if it's anything like that.
Yeah.
It's almost like one of those little booths we had,
I was actually doing as instructed, yes.
Yeah.
So what I think I'd like to try to move to, if I could, would be that when we are in the community with families and attending things with our family and friends, I think we have a much more broader sense of what community is and what the give and take and what the civic duty is. And then somehow when we come into work, we have competing priorities. So it's very easy to say diversity and inclusion is a great thing and let's go in that direction. But the challenge comes when you've got to get into an environment where there are competing forces and there are priorities and how you manage those. But in the community, that's less of an issue. So I would try to bring that community feel into the office, to bring that conscience of community thinking and civic duty into it.
And how does that manifest itself in the workplace?
Right. So how would that manifest itself? So when you look at the way business operates very much on decision making founded on the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so there's a minimum prescribed level of civic duty that is mandated in business decision making, and that's called the Anti-Discrimination Act and Codes of Conduct. And if you could get the mindset around moving away from I don't want to breach this rule because I'll get marked down in my performance score, to a more sense of civic duty based on community thinking that this is actually the right thing to do, and if we do the right thing, the right outcomes will actually also follow.
Yeah.
So how do we find a way to shift to that?
So it's moving away from mere compliance
Right.
towards some kind of notion of responsibility and opportunity. What Lisa said was that she would try and structure a business on the model of a family. And I wonder, did you listen to him or were you back in
Yes.
that? You're right.
Yes, I did listen to him.
Was he speaking in a way that was like what you had in mind, or do you think there's something different about the perspective you considered which may need to be pointed to and which may actually be to do with your gender?
I think it's similar. So getting businesses to also think about the community, but I suppose when I was talking about the because at the moment, if you have a look at how the business sector works, and then how community sector works, and
How family works,
it's all disconnected. And so I would want to bring it kind of back together, if that sort of makes sense.
One thing which I think I heard that was common was something about the importance of relationships. And the other way I think you could frame the compliance model, the minimal one, is almost like a transactional model where you do things because somebody will give you something in return, and it's purely that minimal exchange value. rather than a slightly thicker sense of relationship, which might give rise to mutual bonds of, reciprocal bonds of obligation, which grow with over time. Yeah.
I was just gonna, I work with Sue and work at PwC. We can, from my perspective, I think I've got a triple whammy because I was born in Malaysia and I grew up there. I did my university here and I'm trying to make it in Australia. I worked in Malaysia before, and when I was in Malaysia, never had I felt being a female that there was a glass ceiling because the majority of my bosses were female. My clients in business, they were females, especially in finance. So the CFOs, the heads of tax, they were females, and they are still females. So in my view, a lot of the Asian females, they want to have it all. So, and I've seen that they can have it all, and that's a reflection of the opportunities, of having household help and family looking after kids. So it's quite different than in Australia. And just following up on Lindy's point that, our 60% of our global economy is going to come from Asia. Our Asian clients, clients that we deal with, are in finance, mostly Asian females. So Australia needs to match that dynamics with our future clients.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Do you think that the reason for the much higher incidence of women in very senior roles, including in roles which are often been dominated by men like banking and finance, is it to do with the socioeconomic conditions they have, where you say there's help?
Yes.
Or is it also partly to do with the fact that they are in an environment where they feel entirely safe and at home? Because I can imagine when individuals migrate from one country to another, whether it's me going to Germany or somebody coming from, say, China to Australia, you might almost shut down a little bit and go back to the safe boundaries that you know, which are things like family and almost a more conservative things. Like the Scots people in Australia wear their kilts and play their bagpipes, probably a bit more than the Scottish do back in Scotland, but they grasp onto these old notions. Do you think that has, having been in both societies, do you think that has anything going for it?
I think there's something about, you need to go back to your roots, kind of. Malaysia, there are lots of Asians in Australia, you still have that support. But I don't see, personally, how my connection back to the country is doing work with Asia and, working with my Asian clients and building the Asian business for PwC. So that's my way of connecting back to my roots. But in terms of going back to my normal ways, I think that's probably, I couldn't survive here if I were to, be working like an Asian here, especially in, the business environment. So
why couldn't you survive? What would life be like? Because you would be unable to have any kind of support you need for other things.
Yeah, so support outside of work, I think that's difficult. But in terms of work, it's hard to if you don't meet halfway and meet the leadership requirements or the way of working in Australia, then you would not survive here, basically.
So how would you work differently in a day-to-day way if you were back in KL?
Yeah, I think now that I've been here for a long time, it's also quite a challenge, but I know how to deal with them. I understand the culture.
What is the difference? What would be the main thing? If I was watching you here and then I put you in a clique...
I wouldn't come up. That's one.
You would not be sitting here?
No, I would not be sitting here. I would be, after this event, going up to someone and just, this is my view, I don't agree with so-and-so's view. It's a different, because it's just, respecting hierarchy, respecting...
Who would be sitting here? Would it be all men?
No.
Who would be sitting here?
There will be women, more women
High
than
rank.
men. Yeah,
But
very
high- but
senior
higher
level,
rank.
yeah. If you see
Yeah.
Lindy, that would be Lindy in the Asian. Yeah, so mostly would be also
Okay.
women. Yeah.
What do you think about this and these differences? And do you think if there was a greater socioeconomic support for women coming from an Asian background, that we would see them more likely to go on?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said before, it's only when people had to choose one or the other that they would potentially choose family over career. But if they can have it all, I think a lot of women would love that opportunity. And sometimes, you know, childcare is a really big issue. Whether or not they've got family support at home to look after kids, you know, things like that. And also, if they've got family here, whether or not they need to look after the parents as well. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of additional considerations that women need to think about.
So should we, I mean, this is part of the childcare debate that's taking place more generally in Australia for all women, but it
Yep.
seems it also has an impact in terms of where the heights are that you might choose to scale. I was fascinated by this idea, Ken, that if anybody was sitting here, we would all be senior established figures, and that there wouldn't really be a room for younger, less established voice in the conversation. Is that... how do you see that in the PwC world? You've got a few grey hairs like I have now. Does this...
It took a long time,
Yeah,
eventually.
Has it... You probably dyed them specially.
In fact, I get asked to dye my hair black.
So has it taken a while for you to adjust then to being a senior person and having your own voice recognised in that way?
I think that what was interesting from my own personal experience was that having been born in Australia and feeling, in fact, I've got an older brother and sister who were actually born in Seoul, and so I'm the only family member who was born in Australia. So I was sort of the Aussie one of us, and I grew up not wanting to be different because the only Asian people when I was at school was basically my brother and my sister and myself. So I didn't want to be different. And so by the time I had finished university, started working, convinced myself that there's no Korean thinking in me at all. And I've told this story before, but it was when my wife met my parents that I was warning her about my dad because he's got some very strange Korean ways of thinking. And then on the way home, she was saying to me, when I meet your dad, I know how you evolved because
Right.
the apple didn't fall far from the tree. You think exactly the same as your father. And that was when I realised, so I have actually got some Korean ways of thinking that I've passed.
Can you say what they are? Because when you say my father had some very strange Korean ways of thinking, I'm immediately saying, well, I'd really like to know what they are.
So if you can think, that's a really good question because when what I've learned in the role I've got in diversity is that whenever I meet someone now, I always try to find out how they identify themselves. Whether rightly or they've got it right or wrong, I try to find out how they identify themselves rather than how I identify them. And then I try to understand how they form their points of view. And then I include their points of view in my assessment of a situation and then in my decision making. And I find that brings better outcomes. But when it comes to once I've worked out what someone's identity is, as they tell me, then I try to work out how they think. I always try to think about the dinner table discussions they had when they were growing up, because that shapes a lot of the way that people think. And then a lot of that is derived from the military history of the country of origin of their parents. So for me, if you can think about the dinner table discussions, they were pretty straightforward. Number one was communism is evil. And number two is you're going to have to work 10% harder than the person next to you. And number three, here's how you spot a racist. Right? And then we had the classic sort of scenarios. You drive around Sydney and you drove past an area where there's some pretty crappy houses. You know, you're told that's where you're going to live if you don't work hard. Right. So that's a pretty standard 101 type Asian upbringing. So that's the sort of thinking that I had, that I would work harder. But sometimes if you work harder and you're prepared to work 10% harder, that actually ultimately can be limiting to you Because if you have a group of peers around you and they know you're prepared to work 10% harder, the last thing they're going to want to do is report to you because they think that you're going to hold them to the standards that you've held
That's
yourself.
interesting, yeah.
So in that way, then you realise that you're, in a way, not being aware of that. So at worst, you're just not leadership material because no one would actually want to work for you.
Because you'll drive them too hard.
Right. And the rationale then is well, you lack empathy because you're not understanding how others feel. And in a way, that it's a question of do you actually realise that, acknowledge it, and then understand you need to calibrate in a way to mitigate that, or are you just going to keep doing what you're doing without being conscious of the lens through which your leadership attributes and potential is being viewed?
It's interesting, I've been doing some work with somebody who's come from Germany and believes that they should be able to work as hard as they want, for as long as they want, as long as they don't hurt anybody else. But the environment in which they're operating is specifically set up for work-life balance.
Right.
And so they're really finding it hard to deal with the cultural limitations that are there. And by the way, you haven't taken your children yet past any rough and tumble postcodes, just
Not yet.
it's on the cards. Welcome to the table.
Hi everyone. Hi.
Speaking to that, because that'll record your voice
I
with the
think
camera.
it's not on.
No,
It's on. I'll speak loud into this anyway. I have a few questions on the Twitter sphere for you guys actually.
Oh.
It's floating around. I thought I'd get them out there. The first question I have is the female Asian consumer is shifting the economic power base. How will corporations respond?
and what do they want? Is there anything about the female Asian consumer which is distinctive?
I think that's actually a very good point. Whoever brought it up, actually.
Put your hands up if you don't mind.
Because,
Yes,
because I think people like to talk to people who they can relate to. I mean, it can work both ways as well, but I think having the lack of Asian leaders in those roles means that you're actually missing part of the puzzle. So, okay, some people might actually prefer a man, and that's fine, but then you might have the other half who would prefer a woman. So if you're not going to have people who they can relate to, and I've seen time and time again where you've got clients who couldn't relate to an Australian person or Anglo-Australian person, and as soon as they are able to speak to a person from their cultural background, they started to open up and really talk about what they really need and everything. And sometimes they might not even fully understood what the conversation actually was, even with an interpreter, because interpreting can be, depending on who the interpreter is, could be potentially wrong.
Do you think, as it suggested, is there anything common or distinctive about the female Asian Australian consumer in terms of what they're looking for, apart from someone they can relate to? Are there expectations about quality or attributes of things that are different?
Well, I mean, I suppose even for consumers who are Asian Australians who are now in Australia, I think that there are some distinction as well. Even, for me, for example, I get a lot of my clothes overseas, because of the fact that, it's not just the price. I mean, people think it's because of the price, but it's actually because the style and, everything suits me better if I purchase it overseas. And I think businesses actually need to understand that, so that you're actually catering for that cohort of people. And even just thinking about sizing, because my parents actually work in garment making, but sizing is different for an Asian body as opposed to a European body. So, I mean, things like that, it could be very small, you think, but it can have implications.
I learned something fascinating last week when I was in New Zealand, that the reason why Bunnings can never get men to wear their caps is because a green cap in Chinese culture is only worn by a man whose wife is cheating on him. There's a traditional thing. And so Bunnings have got all these green caps which they're trying to hand out, wondering why a person of Chinese descent would never ever wear one.
Yeah.
Back to the Twitterverse.
The Twitter sphere has another question here. There are many drivers that may lead to ceilings of minorities. What is unique for the female/Asian space?
Say it again, sorry.
So what's unique? There are many different things that can limit opportunity. Is there anything which is uniquely limiting for women of Asian Australian or of Asian background?
Uniquely...
And you might
yeah, you might want to
something.
jump in as well.
Good question, guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say it's because of that double whammy, because of the fact that, because when people think about identity, you can't separate one or the other. So, I mean, I can't really pick whether it's actually a cultural aspect or a gender aspect. But having said that, I mean, it's just the way we tend to relate to other people, and also whether or not to speak up, you know. And Asian, especially women, and especially Asian, and both impacting on the person, that you don't necessarily speak up in, you know, even forums like this. And so you'll firstly have the first barrier, which is, you know, I'm not good enough to be able to speak, you know, in a forum. And then on the other hand, you might have an additional barrier that could be one or the other, so either gender or culture.
Have you got one more? Otherwise, I've got a final question which I'm going to put, and then we're going to wind things up and have some informal time. So,
No, that's it. That's all the questions for now.
well, thank you for those Twitterverse.
I'll leave this here.
I want to finish up by asking you about the strategies that people should be thinking about using, men or women, and they may be different again, and maybe something particularly suitable, in order to address some of the limiting factors that might be preventing the development of broad-scale Asian Australian leadership. So, would you like to join?
Sorry, yes.
Oh, okay. Please do. We'll hold off that. You go first.
Is this on?
It's on, I think. Let me see. Yes, it is.
Okay. I'd just like to quickly introduce myself. I haven't met many of you, but I'm currently the president of the Australia-China Youth Association at Macquarie University, and I was kindly invited to this event by Daily, who's organising the event tonight. As a young Australian, but also of Asian ethnic background, I've personally at many times felt as though I'm not as capable of being in a position of leadership, whether it be in a corporation or even in politics, as you know, my counterparts. And I feel as though it's due to a lack of role models. You know, that we still have the problem of not having many Asian women, or even women in general, in the political realm in Australia. I personally have been very fortunate because I grew up in an independent girls' school, and we were constantly instilled with the belief that women can achieve anything they want to achieve. And you know, my mum is a very strong woman who's single, and she's instilled me with many of these beliefs that I have today. I think that this underrepresentation of women is largely due to a failure to educate young Asian women that they do have the capacity to lead and be in positions of power. I wanted to ask all of you, how do you think we can start to resolve this problem and to educate the youth of today that they do have the capacity to lead and be in positions of power?
Thank you. That's a lovely complementary question to the one that I posed. So you stay there because we'll be finishing up with your question. So we might save the last word for you. So I might ask Ken first, and then we'll come to you.
So if I had to offer any, I guess, tips, number one would be to sharpen your presentation skills, because I think the most important determinant of it as to how far you'll go in your career, whatever you choose to do, is your ability to present, to articulate. Wherever that might be, for example, if you happen to get into the lift and the CEO walks in to the lift, are you going to look down at the floor, or are you going to engage and say to your CEO, I saw your comments on Twitter on the STEM report, I saw this, I've seen you do that, or engage and somehow present what is interesting about you and what is your personal value proposition in a way which makes it, something which is more memorable than just standing in a lift.
So that's been quite bold, isn't it, in some ways, saying to the CEO, hello, I'm here, look at me.
Well, it's basically understanding that there's an opportunity, and every day in everything that you do, you have an opportunity to present. And unless you actually appreciate that it is an opportunity to do so, you won't actually start to exercise and strengthen that muscle. But it's a very important one that needs to be addressed. So that's number one. Number two is I would be pay attention to understand what your values and beliefs are and what the consequential behaviours that follow from those are, and then try to get an understanding of how those are interpreted. And it's important to try to do that, because some of the behaviours that you have, you won't realise the way that they're being interpreted, and that may result in lines being put through your name when it comes to leadership courses.
Can I just say on that, it's a critical point, because human societies can share exactly the same values but express them differently. So friendship for one group might be something which is established by spending time going to a football match or something. In another part of the world, it might be start off with some gift giving and some token of esteem, and it's not uncommon for these things to be misinterpreted. So I think your point about not just knowing your own values and principles, but also knowing how your particular expression of these might be interpreted, and whether that is an advantage or disadvantage to you, is really important advice.
Yeah, I might actually add on that. I think it's also important for people to really embrace their own culture as well, because I've seen people who don't want to be associated with their cultural heritage because they want to fit into the Australian culture, and as soon as you start doing that, you can't see what some of your actions and some of your behaviour can have an impact on your own environment. So I think that's very important for people who wanting to fit in. So you have to know your cultural heritage and understand what that is, but at the same time be able to function in a Australian society. And I share your point about presentation skill is one of the critical thing in leadership. But I also want to add that because in Asian culture we sometimes don't want to fail, and when you want to be a leader you have to take that risk. And sometimes you might do 10 projects and have one that's successful. And so you have to take that risk and just do it, even though you don't know what's going to happen, but make it yours, basically.
I think your point about embracing your own heritage is interesting. I've seen, even in my lifetime, and it's still not finished, but a huge change in the way Indigenous Australians have come to be proud of that extraordinary cultural achievement surviving over those tens of thousands of years. And I think Australia hopefully is getting to a point where it starts to recognise, as Lindley was suggesting, the great advantages to be had by nurturing the extraordinary diversity that happens to live within our continent.
And they've got some really good aspects of their understanding, especially with how to manage the environment and how to look after the land. It's one of those knowledge that only they would understand. And
just still to be here after 50,000 years
after
it's happened. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wind up our conversation now. Clearly, in the course of an hour, we're not going to strip back and identify every single element. We'll come up with the wonderful solutions for everything. But the intention of this series of talks is not that we do that, but rather that we start a conversation which Di and I and everybody else involved at Dawn hope will spread out of this room informally through your networks. But just to bring us to a close before we gather together for a bit more informal conversation, I'll hand back to Di Lee.